David, we're back talking about Acts, and up till now we've heard a little bit about the formation of the early church and about some of the persecutions that were taking place, especially of Stephen. And we've thought a little bit about some of the major themes that Luke is articulating, continuity and discontinuity. We talked a little bit about the temple last time. And we had the introduction of the figure of Paul, right, or Saul at this point, who was there at the execution of Stephen. So the next stage of the game sees a little bit more of Paul playing a role,
Absolutely.
Although Peter and Paul are also both on stage during these next several chapters. Chapter 9 is pretty critical for introducing Paul. It's his conversion experience, right?
Right.
What do you make of this? Is this history? Is it fiction? What's going on with this story?
My sense is that it has deep historical roots. Whether the particular details are historically accurate is tricky, I think, through all of the book of Acts. But it becomes a kind of dramatic description of what Paul describes more thematically in the first 2 chapters of Galatians, where it's clear that there was some remarkable experience that shifted his way of being and his way of understanding himself. Not precisely necessarily the way that Luke describes it, but I think this is extremely important in Paul's own self-understanding, and extremely important for Luke because it comes in 3 times. Once as a third-person description, and twice Paul recounts it of himself as a way of talking about the old Paul and the new Paul, the Paul who was a persecutor and the Paul who is now among the persecuted, among the very sect he was trying to destroy. So I think it's an extraordinarily important moment in the book of Acts, and probably an extraordinarily important moment in Paul's own self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in Paul's own self-description of the revelation he receives from Christ in Galatians, there's no sort of Damascus Road experience.
We don't have Damascus Road experience. We don't have the voices. We don't have the lights. We just have the strong claim that the Lord appeared also to him. And strikingly, in Paul's description in Galatians, a major reason he wants to stress this, and again in 1 Corinthians 9, is to make clear that he's as much an apostle as the others, and that he's an apostle because he saw the risen Lord. Interestingly, when Luke tells the story, there's no, hello, be my apostle, because for Luke, the apostles of that circle of 12, I think, for the most part, and Paul doesn't qualify in the same way.
And Paul needs a little bit of instruction in Luke.
Paul needs considerable instruction in Luke, and he gets that in the presence of Ananias. And Paul, and I want not to make this a seminar on Paul, which my students say I do anyway on everything, but Paul is extraordinarily self-confident, but even he will admit from time to time in his epistles that he received this from someone else. And I think we get in the sense of Ananias the fact that Paul is traditioned into a movement that's really there before him. And the idea that sometimes abroad that Paul's really the founder of Christianity, I think actually doesn't work. He's its most articulate, at least his most published advocate in that first generation. But he comes into a community that's there and with people who know how to instruct him. And Ananias is one of those.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In Paul's own telling, he goes up to Jerusalem and learns of things from the apostles there. So there is some
sense that this is not just me,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So Paul begins to play a role here, but Peter still dominates the action in these couple of chapters, right?
He does, very much so.
And what kinds of actions do we see Peter engaged in?
Well, we see Peter, I think, engaged in a broadening of his own sense of mission, a broadening of his own sense of what God is doing through this Christian mission. And we've seen it in a way when he preaches at Pentecost to the multilingual people. Now he has to face the really difficult question whether this is a gospel that will be a gospel available to the Gentiles as well. And I think for him that's a major breakthrough in terms of what his self-understanding has been. And we see that especially in his relationship to Cornelius and in the vision that they both have of a community that is no longer just for Jews, whether proselytes or born Jews, but is actually now opening up to Gentiles who have not been part of that community.
Say a little bit about that vision, because there's a little bit of a disconnect, isn't there, between the content of the vision?
Yeah, the vision is a vision of all kinds of animals and beasts and kinds of food being lowered down from heaven on a sheet, and Paul says, I can't eat that because it's presumably not kosher.
Peter.
Peter's saying, I can't eat that because presumably it's not kosher. And God says that you call nothing I've made unclean, and then Peter decides that he needs to do it. And the issue is not, the issue in the drama is not what can you eat, it's with whom can you associate, and to whom can you invite to be part of part of this community. But so it becomes a kind of metaphor, though it's interesting, we'll see when we get to chapter 15, that the metaphor comes back around again, and the question of what Gentiles are going to have to eat also becomes important in the church. But at this point, I think, it's a kind of symbol, a vision for the larger sense of community, which doesn't make that distinction between clean and unclean. We had a little bit with the eunuch, right? We were already breaking down those clean, unclean lines in ways.
Right. Of course, the eunuch was probably a proselyte.
Oh yeah, no, almost certainly.
Yeah.
But the idea of the kingdom going beyond the kind of most narrow limits of sexual normality and all that, I think begins to break through.
And here, Cornelius is definitely a Gentile.
Cornelius is definitely a Gentile. Cornelius may be the kind of person that Theophilus may be. He may be one of those Gentiles who is hung around the synagogue enough that he actually knows something of the story, the sacred history that Luke refers to so often.
God-fearer.
A so-called God-fearer. The God-fearers are those who were, in our parlance, friends of the church. Haven't quite made the final move of pledging or being circumcised or being kosher or whatever you need to be, but nonetheless are sympathetic and open to the kind of messages that they're hearing in the synagogue.
So if Peter is the person who affects the conversion of the first Gentile in Acts, what does that say about Luke's understanding of the relationship between Peter and Paul?
Yeah, my sense is that in the book of Acts, Peter and Paul are much more on the same page than they are in Paul's own recounting of their relationship, where it seems to be more troubled and more problematic, and where I think Paul on the whole associates Peter with the more reluctant group about reaching out to the Gentile mission. And I think this is partly, it's the kind of, the analogy I use with my students is that when I was in 6th and 7th grade, my assumption was that Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington and Franklin got together on a regular basis for cigars and brandy and to agree on the future of the country, and that when I became a man or an adult, I discovered that on many things they disagreed about all kinds of things. But the kind of party line, not a stupid party line, is that this group, this nation, was founded by people in great agreement. I think Luke wants to say that this church, this movement of which we're a part, was founded by these great leaders who were very much in agreement about these issues. When we read Galatians especially, it's not quite so clear that Paul and Peter were that much of the same mind. And sometimes in Galatians, Paul will refer to Peter semi-sarcastically as a kind of a so-called pillar of the church. And I suspect Peter didn't think he was a so-called pillar of the church.
Right. And doesn't Paul also say that there was an agreement that Peter would be
the apostle of the Jews?
And
he would be the
Paul
apostle of the
the
Gentiles. Right. And Luke clearly lets Peter get to the Gentiles first in an important way. And then Paul follows that example and follows it hugely, but he follows it.
And this picks up a little bit on that theme that we talked about a time or two ago about the apostles being sort of the core of the leadership of the church, even though they don't do an awful lot. Nonetheless, there's a kind of flow of authority.
There's a solidity of authority there.
Right.
Yeah, there's a way in which I think you can trace through, although I haven't done this with any great care, you can trace through the apostles. And so the apostles almost have to validate that Gentile mission for it to be valid. Then Paul, and then from Paul to the elders, and then from the elders to us, or to the generation that reads these stories. So that from my Baptist perspective, as opposed to some people with a different version of apostolic succession, we've always argued the apostolic succession is a succession of the teaching from generation to generation rather than the succession of ordination. But there's strongly sense of continuity in Luke and Acts. Nobody makes this up, including Paul.
Mm-hmm. One interesting feature here about the importance of this Cornelius episode is the repetition.
Yeah.
We have the story told, and then we have Peter retelling it in the next chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
So Luke invests this with a
huge amount.
lot of significance.
There's a huge. I think looking back, we look at Pentecost as being so crucial, and we look at Acts 15 as being so crucial. But I suspect, just in terms of the emphasis and the dramatic power, that this story of Peter and Cornelius is almost the hinge of Acts story, because the gospel really does now move from the people of Israel to that larger world.
There are a couple of other interesting things that go on in these chapters. So we have the Gentiles coming in. We have this very interesting vision that also has some implications for kashrut laws, and we're going to come back to that in chapter 15.
Yeah.
But then we have a deliverance story, Peter being delivered from prison. And this is not the first time that this has happened, right? This is in chapter 12.
It's not.
What do you make of that episode and the sequel to it?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, I think that the prison stories become kind of paradigmatic of what Luke wants to say, Acts wants to say, is the situation of the church, which is that we are constantly in danger and constantly redeemed. We'll see it happen to Paul in its own way. In an interesting way, it happened to Jesus between the crucifixion and the resurrection. And I think the life of the church is constant danger, nonetheless, God's still in charge. There's also humor in this one, because when Peter gets out, you remember he comes up to the door and knocks on the door, and Rhoda, who's one of the disciples.
This is the house of Mary.
This is the house of Mary, and Rhoda is so excited that she, rather than saying, "Come in, Peter," right, she dashes in and says, "Peter's out there, Peter's alive," and they say, "Well, Peter's rescued from jail," and they say, "Well, where is Peter?" "Oh, I forgot to bring him in," right? So I think Luke's a great storyteller. He's got Saul standing there when Stephen gets martyred. He brings us a little bit of sense of the fact that God has a good sense of humor at this point.
This is almost a comic interlude, isn't it?
It's a comic interlude in the midst of a story that's in some ways getting increasingly heavy.
Because we have a couple of deaths framing this,
We
right?
got James,
Right.
and
Then the death of Herod.
the death of Herod, right?
Which is kind of grisly, isn't
Yeah,
it?
extraordinarily grisly, and I suspect he had it coming. He's in there somewhere, in some kind of sense that this is God, for Acts. I think Luke and Acts, more than any other book in the New Testament, it's not just that God is in charge of our human lives, our individual lives, and not even just that God's in charge of the church, though all that is true, but God is the great playwright of this larger story that includes Herod, as it included Caesar Augustus back at the beginning of chapter
Which
1.
Herod is this, by the way? There are a number of Herods that float around.
Yes, this is grandson of the great, right?
Right, so Herod Agrippa the First.
Thank you
right?
very much. I knew all those things once. I used to know the family tree.
Okay, so there we are, Peter and Paul playing a major role.
But in sync, right?
Right. And we also learned one other interesting feature here about the church as a whole, its name.
It's Christian.
Right.
For the first time.
According to Luke, and that took place in
Antioch.
What do you make of that? Is that a historical detail?
I don't see why not. How's that? I can't think of any particular reason why he would put that one in there if there wasn't some kind of reminiscence that this movement, this way, first self-identified as Christian in Antioch. And Antioch seems to have been, all through Acts, seems to be there at key moments. I suspect that was the home of a fairly flourishing Christian community.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And it's a Greek term, right? So
Right.
it's a designation for this group.
Right. The
Probably
Christianos is a Greek term, yes.
Right,
Yeah.
probably a derogatory term.
Yeah, those Christ people.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
That would have first arisen in a place like
Yeah,
Antioch.
where they could have made
so
fun of them at the same time as...
that makes a certain amount of sense.
It does. Well, it's like the Quakers, who thought of themselves as friends, and everybody else thought of them as Quakers because they quaked. And they've kind of owned that now. They're not ashamed to be Quakers. Christians weren't ashamed to be Christians.
So the church is flourishing despite all this persecution.
Despite all this persecution, sometimes through all this persecution, I think.
Right, and we'll see more of this coming up.
It keeps coming.